Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to see you here tonight. This is the January 2024 textual study on the Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our guest scholar this evening is Dr. Brandon Scontt. In this study, we'll be talking about whether Paul actually converted to Christianity or not. All the artwork about his trip to Damascus shows him being struck off his horse. How did that happen? Was he Jewish or Christian when he was traveling around? These are some of the questions we'll be getting into tonight. But first, let me tell you just a little bit about Brandon. In addition to his long list of academic credentials, I want to say that he's a terrific nature photographer too. And I love that he shares his amazing photos, especially of birds, of an interest of mine also. Anyway, more to the subject of Paul in the Bible. I should say that Dr. Scontt is the Dartmouth Distinguished Professor Emeritus of New Testament at the Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa. He's the author and editor of 20-some books, including The Real Paul, Recovering His Radical Challenge, and he's a charter member of the Jesus Seminar for West Star. I'd like to remind you that we actually rely on your financial support to make these discussions happen. The best way to support is to go to Patreon and support us there because it provides a steady support. In case you don't know it, supporters who contribute at the $15 a month or more are also invited to our semi-annual Zoom parties. Please know that any level of support is extremely helpful. PayPal and checks are also welcome and so much appreciated. Thank you for cheering us on. And so now, Brandon, I'd like to turn to you. And I have to say that you have asked a provocative question in the title of your presentation tonight. Did Paul actually convert to Christianity? Of course, Christians who read the Bible all know the moment of Paul's conversion on his way to Damascus. He had been persecuting the Christians, and after he was struck with a light, he recognized the real meaning of Jesus and became a Christian. But you have asked us to think about some questions that might put this in a new light. So why don't we start with just getting to know what we should know about Paul himself? He was a Jew, right? Is it true that he had been persecuting Jesus' followers?
Well, you got two questions. He was a Jew, of
Okay,
course.
yes. All right.
All right. And you need to say the of course with a little emphasis.
Okay.
Because he's proud of his Judaism.
Okay, all right.
All righty. He describes himself several times as having a zeal for the traditions of his father. He mentions that in Philippians and he mentions it in Galatians. Zeal is in this period a very positive word. It's become kind of a negative word in our culture because of connected to zealousness, but it's positive. And he describes himself in Philippians, he boasts of the fact that he was circumcised on the 8th day. He belongs to the people of Israel. He's the tribe of Benjamin. He's not the tribe of Judah. He's one of the minor tribes. He's a Hebrew born of Hebrews. Okay, so his bloodline is pure. Hebrew born of Hebrews. And according to the law, he's a Pharisee. And he does not say any of that is in the past. That's a present description of him. Okay, he doesn't take any of that away and say, that's what I used to be. He does say it's no longer a matter of honor. It was something he boasted in. Now he boasts being in Christ, in the anointed. But that's also Jewish. Okay, the anointed is Jewish, the Messiah.
Okay.
So got to put the Messiah, the Judaism front and center. He is a Jew. And if you read Romans, he thinks Gentiles are garbage. He doesn't think real highly of them, So that has to kind of be balanced there. Don't wipe it away. And in fact, I think one of the interesting things, he holds up his persecution of Christians as an example of his zeal.
Okay.
And he never apologizes for it.
Yeah.
Now I want to back up again. I said he held up his persecution of Christians. I misspoke. He never says he persecuted Christians because the word isn't used in his period.
Okay.
That's a word that comes much later.
All right. So what was the persecuting then?
He says the community of the anointed.
Community.
Or what most people would translate the Church of Christ and not the denomination. Okay. So it's the community, the ecclesia, the people who are called together, okay, are called out to be together. That's the group he persecutes. And persecute's not a bad translation of the Greek there. You have to be a little careful because we tend to read into that the later Roman persecutions of Christian martyrs. That's not what he's doing. Okay. He's at best what we would call harassing or terrorizing them.
Okay.
So you have to kind of don't read later texts, what Roman officials are doing into this period.
But at least we can see that he's against them.
Well, the way to think of it is he thinks they're heretics.
They're heretics. All right.
To use a later term that Christians used about each other, he thinks these are false Jews.
False Jews, right.
Why are they false Jews? Because they think the Jesus who was crucified is the Messiah. Well, that's clearly nuts.
Okay, then. All right. So we got him clearly as a Jew, and we can be settled there. Then what happened on the way to Damascus? Did he get struck off his horse?
Well, first of all, did everybody read the Acts passages? There's no horse in Acts.
Okay. Okay.
There's no horse. That's an invention. That's an invention of later mythology. Everybody assumes he fell off a horse, and all the art shows he fell off a horse, but there's no horse in Acts. And if he had been on a horse on a Roman road, he would have to have been a Roman soldier.
Okay.
Okay, so you got a problem there right off the art comes in much later, and it's envisioning Paul as a nobleman, if somebody of worth and value. So you put him on a horse like you put a nobleman on a horse. That's how that gets into the story. But
all right.
Okay.
Okay, so he's walking along to Damascus then.
Well, actually, if you read Paul, he never says he was on the way to Damascus. He actually says he was in Damascus.
All right.
So it's in the Damascus area, but you don't have to imagine him on the journey. Acts puts him on a journey. Why? What's one of Acts' primary names for this group is the way. So Paul's on the way. You got to kind of play on words here. You got to use your imagination here, okay? So Paul never describes where he is when this event happens. And he never describes light is totally from Acts, because Acts wants Paul to have a vision. And Acts actually says he has an opsia, a vision. Paul says he does not have a vision. He says he has an apocalypsis. He has a revelation.
Okay.
Something that is hidden is made known to him. That's what the word means. And it does not describe an event, it describes an experience. And Paul explicitly says in a number of places, for example, in the Corinthians, that he doesn't have visions. So he doesn't think his original experience is a vision. He thinks it's an apocalypsis. God reveals to him something. And you have to use that word, I think, in a strong sense. It is a radical experience that changes his life.
Okay, right.
So that's the kind of context, again, to think about it in.
And then was there light involved in this? I just want to get this picture.
That's Acts. Take Acts and set it aside. Acts is written, if this event happens to Paul 2-3 years after the resurrection, Acts isn't written until after the end of the first century. So you're 70, 75 years down the pike. A lot has happened. So Acts, if you would ask me, I would say Acts is legendary on Paul's experience. And remember, Acts wants to make Paul subordinate to the apostles in Jerusalem, whereas Paul thinks he's their equal.
All right. So then there's a difference between Acts and Paul, which
Yes.
you're helping us to see
You
here.
should always try to understand Paul from Paul, not from Acts.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Go with the best evidence.
So then maybe you could describe to us then, what does Paul think about this experience? And you said that he saw it as a revelation. Would you say that he disagrees then with the way Acts describes it?
Well, he doesn't know what Acts says because he's dead and gone when Acts is.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, would he have disagreed with that?
I think he would have disagreed with it pretty radically.
Okay. All right.
That it would actually be a falsification. Because Paul specifically in the one place where he talks about it, which is in Galatians,
yeah,
he says that when the one who had set him apart before I was born, and he's quoting Isaiah. So he's telling you right off the bat, this is a prophetic experience.
Okay.
For him, he's the last of the great prophets. That's what he means by being an apostle. He's the apostle, the sent one. That's what apostolos means, the one sent by God as a prophet to the nations, to the Gentiles.
So then maybe you could describe what a prophet is that's different from us being sent. What is a prophet?
That's the same thing. That's what a prophet is. A prophet is sent with a message to the people.
Well, and apostles use the word sent also, isn't that right?
That's what the word means. Apostolos means the one who is sent.
So, but what does a prophet mean then?
A prophet means the same thing.
So that's what I'm getting at, is prophet and apostle are the same idea.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Then
but the question you might want to ask is, why doesn't he call himself a prophet?
Okay. Yeah. Let's ask that question. Good one.
Okay. That's a good question. Because if you read Maccabees, prophecy had ended.
Okay. True.
So you have to, he's saying this is the same kind of thing that happened in olden times when we had prophets, but now we call it apostolos. It just simply moves to a different term.
So, but I think apostles, we tend to think of them as being specifically sent by Jesus, as opposed to the prophets being sent by God. Is that right?
Well, you might think of it that way, but is that how Paul uses the term?
Well, that's what I'm getting at. Is so Paul is seeing himself as being an apostle from God, not necessarily from Jesus.
Yeah. He is apostle sent from God to announce the good news of Jesus.
Okay, then with his bold letter writing, as you put it, do you think he thought of himself as establishing the new religion of Christianity at that point?
No.
Okay.
Step back and ask yourself, what does Paul think? What does this revelation that Paul has, what is it? What does it amount to?
Yeah.
What is revealed to him? Okay, so start with the problem. For Paul, why is Paul persecuting Christians? Because he doesn't like them? He's persecuting them because he thinks they have proclaimed Jesus Messiah, and that's false. How does he know Jesus is not the Messiah? Because he died on the cross. And you cannot be the Messiah. I just wrote a blog about this.
Yes, you did. It's beautiful. It's on our Early Christian Text website. I hope everybody reads it because it's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. So in Paul's mind, the one who hangs on a cross is cursed. Therefore, Jesus cannot be the Son of God. He cannot then, Son of God and Messiah in this period mean the same thing. They're interchangeable. They're messianic terms. So cannot be the Son of God because he lost. The Romans won. That's what crucifixions mean. So the revelation that Paul gets is, in fact, that Jesus is the Messiah and that God is acting by different standards. God has turned the world upside down and done something different. So that's an apocalypsis. That's a radical transformation.
Yeah.
That's not something you can deduce. I mean, it's interesting that, later in the Christian tradition, there's a lot of scripture quoting and proving from proof text. Paul never tries to do that because he knows it's not going to work. That was why he was after them. I think the word heretic, it's not a term they would have used, but it's a good description of what he thinks is going on with these people. They're heretics. So in this revelation that he has, this inbreaking of God in this experience, he sees, it's different than I thought it was.
Yeah.
So that's what happens. Now, that means he's called to announce the good news that God is acting in this way, that the Messiah has come, and the nations have this chance to follow the Messiah.
So you did a great job in explaining on the blog post about how Paul can get around the problem. Maybe you could explain that here too. How does he get around the idea that he's now following this guy who failed as a savior?
Because he reverses all the categories. It's kind of an oxymoronic, paradoxical argument, and that's why you get this. It's become because of Augustine in many ways, and Luther, this kind of theology of the cross has become so common to us, we don't realize that it's really stupid. Paul says, I preach nonsense.
Okay, now what do you mean by stupid? What's stupid about it?
It doesn't make any sense.
So
if you got crucified, you lost. You're a loser.
Okay.
Trump would be all over you.
Okay. All right. So go on then and explain, how does he get around this?
He doesn't. He says in the revelation of God, you see in that action the activity of God. It requires on your part. That's what faith is. It sees through this.
Okay.
To see what's really going on. What we have done is taken theology and wipe away the scandal so that we wear crosses on our necks, as jewelry. But we ought to wear hypodermic needles because that's how we execute people.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear. Okay.
Now, see, you just had the experience that old deer was the experience of just how horrific this is.
Yeah.
But in our common, ordinary speech, it's lost its horrific character.
Yeah.
For Paul, it has that horrific character.
So, going back to the idea of establishing Christianity, so he had a vision about this new way of understanding God. Did he have any? But he did go around and set up little communities, didn't he?
But he's setting up these communities for what purpose? These are communities of the anointed.
Okay.
Communities of the Messiah. So what these communities are doing is awaiting for the final coming of the Messiah.
Okay.
When God will set creation correct, set it right. They're waiting for the end. So it's not a new religion. They're not doing some new religious practice. They are in fulfillment of Israel itself.
So then you wouldn't even say that they converted.
They convert.
There's
a difference here.
Okay.
They belong to the nations. They worship false gods. They belong to a long tradition. They now will worship the God of Israel.
Okay. So did he ever speak to Jews then in terms of changing something?
Okay, here's the tricky part. And Paul, if you read Galatians carefully, he says he is called to go to the nations.
Yeah.
Peter goes to the Jews. So he doesn't talk about the Jews. We don't know exactly what he thought the Jews were supposed to do. I assume what he thinks is they're supposed to accept Jesus as the Messiah.
Okay. Well, he did criticize the Jews in his writings, in his letters. So was he just, pardon me?
Where?
In Romans, doesn't he criticize them there?
Where? He says all Israel will be saved. They carry the truth. Doesn't sound like criticism to me.
Well, but what about when he's saying that you shouldn't, the circumcision is not the point?
Oh, who's he talking to?
Why assume Jews?
No, he's talking to Gentiles. His problem is
Yeah,
Gentiles
okay.
who want to get circumcised. That
Right.
is, they think they have to become Jews in order to be saved. No, they belong to the nations. They have a new covenant. Israel belongs to an old covenant, which is still valid
Yeah.
and will be fulfilled in the Messiah.
All right. Then would you consider Paul a successionist?
I don't like those terms because I'm not exactly sure what you're going to have me say.
Well, okay. So the way we use
Certainly
them,
not a super successionist. He doesn't think Israel is being replaced.
okay. All right. So, but something new is happening though.
Yes, and a way to understand that new is that instead of the Messiah to something to happen in the future, it's now happening now. That's what has happened is the timetable has changed. What was in the future is now happening now.
So let's go back to Acts if you don't mind, because I know you said that it's written so much later and it has another kind of agenda from what Paul does. Um, wouldn't that author have had access to Paul's letters?
It's kind of interesting. He never quotes Paul's letters, never
Okay.
uses any of Pauline's terms. There's no justification by faith in Acts at all. That none of the primary theological categories in Paul uses are in Acts. He never pictures Paul writing to another community, completely absent. He
So
doesn't
why do you think then the Acts would have emphasized Paul if he was not really connecting with his message?
because he is the founder of these churches. He's a church founder. In the second century, Paul is primarily noted as a church founder, not as a theologian or a letter writer. There's very little quoting of Paul in the second century. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, for example, never quote Paul.
Okay, that's another story. Well,
That's
actually,
just an example, though, that
yeah,
people in this period are, we see, we think Paul is really important because he
yeah,
really dominates the canon.
right.
He really does. There's more about Paul in the canon than there is Jesus, if you just
Yeah,
count up the pages.
yeah.
Okay. But that represents an accident of the canon. There's no evidence that in the first century, Paul is all that significant.
And you mean by that the first century people that you're aware of didn't talk about him that much? Is that what makes you say that?
Yeah.
So how is it then that we are so imbued with Paul everywhere? How come he got
Because of the canon.
and I mean, I'm just saying, how did the canon draw on him then?
Well,
What
the
made that?
canon collects stuff that gets written over a period of time, and in the third and fourth century, it starts to come together. And Acts became a kind of central part of the formation of the canon. So
So
you have this kind of line that runs through Paul, but there's lots of other stuff going on in the first two centuries that have nothing to do with Paul.
So do you think then that the writer of Acts brought Paul's letters to, or not his letters, but his identity into importance?
I think the author of Acts belongs to a Pauline community. He belongs to one of these churches that Paul founded.
Okay.
And he's trying to develop, he's really the first one to begin to develop what later becomes be called apostolic succession.
Okay.
He's not doing it, but he's started to figure out the pieces. And so Paul founded his church, and that's how he views the world, just through the eyes of that community.
Okay. So if it doesn't make sense to say that Paul converted to Christianity, maybe could you describe what you think his most important contribution is to Christianity?
You'd have to tell me which version of Christianity you want me to have an influence on.
Okay. Why don't we start with
I'm
the...
actually serious. I mean, that,
I know, I agree. I understand it's a good question, but let's go to 4th century then, when the church is emerging, if that's the right word. How would he have contributed to that sense of Christianity?
well, in the 4th century, in the late 3rd and 4th century, you do have, but by the late 3rd and 4th century, Christianity is a new religion.
Yeah.
And it is separate from Judaism.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no evidence that anybody in the first 2 centuries thinks of themselves as separate from Judaism. They think they belong to the Jewish tradition. They belong to the tradition of Israel. Their scriptures are Israel's scriptures. Their God is Israel's God. So that's not a new religion.
Okay.
That's working within the confines. They think they are the fulfillment. But remember, Judaism has lots of different versions, so that there's a version that already thinks the anointed is here, not a particularly big problem. Okay? But when the time you get to the 3rd century, the Roman Empire, Jews have revolted 3 times by the time you get to that point, and you're in a pretty negative atmosphere. So these followers of the Messiah have got a problem. Is Rome going to identify them with these Jews who are revolting? And so you begin to get a separation, a really strong separation, in which Christians identify as somebody else. And then when Rome begins to persecute them, that really accelerates Christian identification. There's nothing like martyrdom to accelerate identification with the group. That really solidifies self-understanding very quickly. And so,
the word God, yes.
Yeah, so they start to really pull apart in right, so that you then do have 2 different religions. But I would say, if you looked at a group of Jesus followers in the 2nd century, you would have a hard time telling them apart from the synagogue down the street. They look pretty much alike. But one would have a Messiah that has already come, and the other would still be waiting for a Messiah. So that might be the big difference. But that, on a day-to-day basis, that might not be all that important.
Yeah. Would you say then that that Paul regarded his experience in Damascus, not on the way to Damascus?
It might be on the way to Damascus. He just doesn't say.
Okay.
I don't.
Do you think that Paul considered that to be a major religious change for the world in some way?
Yeah.
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 And how would you? And so the main point of that is that he had a revelation from God, and that revelation was what? What would you call that revelation?
The revelation was that Jesus was the Son of God. That is, that he was the Messiah, and that crucifixion did not mean Rome won.
Oh, okay. That's powerful. That's very helpful to hear. All right.
That's the revelation. So if Rome didn't win, there's something else big coming. And Paul knows what that is. It's God's going to redeem. It's the Jewish myth. God's going to redeem the cosmos.
Yeah.
Renew it.
All right. Well, so now it's time for me to relinquish my interview seat to everybody else here and let everybody else have a chance to talk to you. And so you can unmute yourselves and then put your hand up. It's best if you do it electronically so I can see all the hands. If you want to know how to do that, you go to reactions, and then you'll see the little button to raise your hand. And you have a chance to talk to Brandon yourself. Ask him any questions. He loves to tell you things.
So I'm getting that all of a sudden a strong Jewish believer suddenly had a change of thought and saw that Christ, the Messiah, was not just a Jewish thing, but that it was for the world. Is that kind of the radical thing, part of the radical thing?
No. Jews always thought the Messiah was for the whole world.
Okay, but maybe that it's coming immediately And they got to do
really
something
new
about it.
for Paul is it's happened now. There's two things for Paul that are really important to see. One, he thought the crucifixion meant Jesus could not be the Messiah. In fact, he took that as proof. You know, the Messiah should conquer his enemies, not be destroyed by them. That's fundamental. Okay. So if you're going to take over the world, you have to start by winning. I mean, just follow the logic. Yeah. And what he experiences, that's what, Luther and Augustine mean by the theology of the cross. This scandal that this is how God's going to operate. This is not the expected way. But he also thinks the second thing is it has happened now. Now is the beginning of the end of the world. Or you can view the end of the world in two ways here. In Judaism, end of the world really means the restoration of creation. It doesn't mean it's destruction. Remember, in Judaism, creation is good. God's not going to destroy God's creation. God's going to redeem it, going to fix it.
Really beautiful. I would like
to wait. You said there were two things.
That's the two things. The one thing is that God is acting through the crucifixion, that it does not have the meaning we think it has, that it's, a defeat, but it really represents a victory. That's why Paul uses all this language about folly and nonsense in Corinthians. He is going right in the face of it. In order to see this as God's activity, it's like a Zen koan. You have to break through the normal ways of viewing things.
Thank you, Joy. Very good. I want to point out to everyone too that you can use the chat to leave questions also, and we have a question from Honor. I'm going to read to you what Honor is saying. In his simile of the olive tree and the branches cut off and others grafted in, is that not indicated some criticism of his fellow Jews?
No. What's the olive tree? It's Israel. It's the true root. Who's grafted in? The nations, the Gentiles. So there's no critique there at all. The tree gets pruned, people get lost, but the root, the real tree, is Israel. And the nations get grafted on. It's a put down of the nations, if you really look at the image.
Okay, that's helpful. And Anita, you're next.
What is the role of the resurrection for Paul? Is that sort of the defining moment of how he moves beyond the cross?
No.
Okay.
It's really interesting that in all of his argument, Paul's a believer in the resurrection. That's not the point.
Right.
He never uses resurrection to overcome cross.
Interesting.
For him, the cross itself is the scandal, and that's what you have to get through. So he sees cross and what resurrection really means for Paul is, yes, crucifixion is the way God acts. It is a very radical thought.
And then, so how is resurrection then? How does it relate or not relate then to the cross?
It relates in that it shows that God has acted for the crucified one. But Paul, take a look at the Philippians hymn in Philippians 2:6. Who is super exalted? The crucified one. He is exalted as crucified. It does not change him into uncrucified.
Mm-hmm.
So you can, if you read the Philippians hymn, Philippia was a Roman colony. It's a colonia. It's not a Greek city. There's a lot of Greeks in it, but I mean, it's founded as a colony. And the Philippians hymn reads like a Roman triumph. So the super exalting is, the victor in the chariot riding to victory, but in that chariot is the crucified Lord. not some magnificent emperor. So it really forces you to think of the resurrection as exalting the crucified one.
If I may, could I do a sort of a follow-up?
Sure.
Do you see Paul's thinking on that change over the course of his letters? Because if I think of First Thessalonians, I think of this real focus on the immediate return of the anointed one in the clouds, whether that's metaphoric or whatever.
I think he thinks it's real.
Right. But by the time you get to Romans, there seems to be some moderation on that.
I don't think Roman moderates it at all. I think the real issue in Romans is the focus.
Okay.
And the focus on Romans is really trying to explain to this. I think Romans is probably the last letter, and he's trying to get to Rome. The Romans don't know him.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that way, it's a letter of introduction. And his big fear in Rome is the Jews have recently been expelled from the city. So this particular community is now made up of non-Jews who are followers of the anointed, whereas previously it was probably a mixed community. And they are maybe feeling a little triumphant. And he wants to argue to them that, no, the real root is still Israel. And that's what the whole last part of Romans is about. You know, that Israel is the true root, and that when the restoration takes place, Israel will be restored. So I think that's, he's trying, there's a way, if you read the earlier Pauline letters, and they've been read this way in the tradition, you could read Paul as saying, because he goes only to the nations, that he's not interested in Israel. Well, that's not his mission. That's not his call. But that can also be used against him, that Israel is somehow being rejected. And that's what he specifically wants to block in Romans. So I think the eschatology is not less, it's just not the focus. He clearly thinks at the end of Romans 12 and 11 that the eschaton's close.
Very helpful question there. Thank you, Anita. So let me ask you about why would you say Paul felt so driven to travel? I mean, before his experience where he had this revelation, he was obviously zealous in terms of defending the Jews. Did this revelation change his heart from the Jews to the nations?
I think you can answer this question in two different ways, and you're speculating. First of all, Paul likes to describe himself as zealous. So I would assume that's a characteristic of his personality.
Okay.
He's a kind of driven person.
Right.
Both
I can get that.
before the revelation and after the revelation.
Yeah.
Second thing is, if Galatians is right, and I see no reason to argue with Galatians, his mission is to announce euangelizitai. Announce is just a weak translation. It means to preach the gospel to all the nations. And this is going to end soon. He has not got much time and cover a lot of territory. So, I mean, I think that's how that works. I think he's driven. I think it's an aspect of his personality. I think he was a very difficult person to get along with. He seems to have a breakup with everybody he works with.
Yeah.
Most of the communities he founds get angry at him. And he doesn't have much time.
Is that why he's angry, do you think?
No, I think he's just driven. Driven people are hard to live with.
Oops. Okay. So I guess I'm trying to understand why he ended up being so utterly influential in the whole rest of the Christian evolution when he was so making everybody angry. He wasn't that well known in the first century. You said he got around and then he was making churches, but why did the churches coalesce around him then? If he, with what? What was he? What was his message that was catching on?
It wasn't his message that was catching on. It was the churches he founded.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. Is how did he found a church then? What was of interest to them to come to that? Because they suddenly loved Jesus?
Oh, I don't think loving Jesus has anything much to do with it. I think that's a very modern kind of view. I think they join these communities because they find life in them. They find life and meaning, and to use, redemption. These are places of healing that create real life, and that's what gets them going and what keeps them going.
So what I want to follow through with on that is, do you think was his message when he had this revelation that he wanted to get out to the nations? Or do you think that was inherent just because people were getting hungry for this?
I don't know how to answer the question. I mean, it's a kind of horse and a cart question.
All right, well, that's probably true. I guess I'm trying to understand Paul.
I think the other thing to really think about here is, and this is going to sound silly, and I don't mean it silly. It's a serious response. They're making it up as they go along.
Okay.
They're figuring out what this means and how it plays out as they go along. It doesn't come with a catechism. They didn't have a manual. They're really working it out. And so it's a lot of experimentation. Some things work, some things don't.
So then when Jesus, again, his revelation had to do with Jesus, right?
His revelation had to do with Jesus was the Son of God.
Right.
Remember, Paul doesn't quote Jesus. He doesn't have anything to quote. So there's no message of Jesus in Paul. I'm not trying to be, I'm just pointing out.
Yeah, all right. But so he's finding Jesus as the Son of God, not because of what Jesus said, but because of these
Because
experiences.
he died and was raised. That's it.
That's it. And do you think that is the kernel that caught on in these communities?
I think what that kernel produces is a certain kind of experience of wholeness.
Right.
Everything we know about these communities in the late first and second and throughout the second century, it's all based around community life, and it's not community life in the sense we think of it. It's based in house churches. These are people living, these are small communities, 10, 15 people around a house. Everything we know says that's the way it works. Common sharing, people living in rather desperate situations find help. That's what they mean by salvation.
Yeah, help. I love that word.
That's what it means.
Joy, go ahead again.
Well, what I'm thinking you're saying is that Jesus was crucified. I mean, that's hell all over there, and they're living in hell. And what Paul suddenly realizes that the salvation, the redemption is coming even to those who are being crucified or in hell or are being...
Especially to those.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, I get it.
Great. So, yeah, do you want to elaborate on that, Brendan?
No.
Oh, okay. All right. Bill Sweet, you got your hand up.
Hello. It's very interesting. I caught it that you thought that when Saul was on the way to Damascus, that experience in Acts was a retrofitting. It really didn't happen that way. It was something else. Because you said they make things up as it comes along. Well, what do you guess is the story behind what happened? It wasn't immersed in light or something. It was something else, or it was something.
I think Paul, twice Paul refers to this event. Once is in Galatians, where he simply describes it as an apocalypse, and that's all the information he gives. And the second time is in 1 Corinthians 15, where he puts himself at the end of the list of those who have seen the Lord. And the Greek there is actually an aorist passive, have been seen. He doesn't say he's seen in an active sense. He's using a word ophe that's used in the Septuagint for a revelation event. It's the word that's used when Moses sees Yahweh at the burning bush. In the Greek text, it's ophe. So it's actually very consistent. He's not going to give us any information. He's just not doing it.
So if he's not giving us information, then that somebody had to make a story up to fill the gap, so to speak.
Well, the same thing happens about the resurrection experience itself. So Paul has this list in 1 Corinthians 15 of people who have seen the Lord, and you have these stories of visions or appearances in the later gospel traditions. And they don't mix. They don't fit together very well at all. So that gets made up in a similar kind of way. Once you start, the first gospel is Mark, and it ends in 16:8 with the women going away and saying nothing. Jesus, there's no appearance story in Mark. The appearance stories come later. We're getting way off the topic, but it's a good topic,
Yeah, no, I think it fits. I think the whole idea.
And at that point, when you have to tell the story, it's one thing to confess, I have seen the Lord. When you have to say, what did you see? Then it gets more complicated. Well, Paul never answers that question. Later, people try to tell you what they thought he saw, but that's not Paul. He's reluctant to say anything. I think for Paul and for these early people, because it's a matter of pistis. They don't see it as any kind of empirical thing. It's a matter of experience. And I think we would use the kind of deep interiority to talk about this kind of language. But they don't. Pardon me?
Excuse me. Would you think it would be safe to say that the story of Paul and Saul on the way to Damascus was a device to try to explain how Paul changed his mind? It was used for that purpose. It's not necessarily accurate, but they had to say something about how come this guy switched his personality and his beliefs so much, so drastically.
Yeah, I think it's done for two reasons. One is he wants to strike Paul blind and have him healed. Remember, healing is terribly important in the book of Acts. And he wants to have him instructed by Ananias. Neither one of those things does Paul mention. In fact, Paul explicitly says in Galatians that he didn't confer with any human being, and he did not go up to Jerusalem or speak to any of the apostles. So, he rules out the Acts story. Christopher Sindel used to say he thought some version of the Acts story was being told against Paul in Paul's day. And that might be true. I don't know. But he does not want to physicalize, because he views it, I hate to say it this way, but it's really right. He views it as a spiritual event. So spiritual things by their nature should not be physicalized. Although we like to do it.
Oh, thank you so much. Interesting questions, Bill. So Arnold, what's on your mind?
Brandon, in your book, After Jesus, Before Christianity, you speak about the master narrative. And my experience is that many of my friends really work to hang on to that master narrative. The idea that Jesus came down from heaven, did wonderful things, passed on his teachings to the apostles, who passed them on to the deacons, and finally down to the 4th century, and now we have the Nicene Creed. The information in your book, The Real Paul, and that which you've been talking about tonight, really puts a roadblock in that master narrative.
Well, first of all, the master narrative isn't created in its full form until the 4th century. So you can find the pieces of it in the New Testament, but it's not in any book in the New Testament. You have to put the piece, and people do that because they carry it around in their head, and so they pick and choose what they want and create the master narrative. It's fairly easy to do.
Brendan, could you explain a little bit more about what the master narrative is? I don't know that everybody's read the book, and I want to make sure we stay with you on what you mean by this.
The master narrative, that's not an invention of the book. I mean, that's a common phrase used on New Testament scholars. The master narrative is Jesus came down from heaven, okay, and preached the gospel and everything, and made apostles, then was crucified, was raised from the dead, and the apostles then began to preach, and then Paul was converted, okay, and Christianity got going, and off to the races you go, and that becomes your master narrative. That's not in any text in the New Testament. It's parts of it are in various parts of the New Testament, but that as a whole is not in the New Testament. For example, no gospel has Jesus come down from heaven. In the fourth gospel, which is the only one that has a gospel that has any motion from heaven to earth, it's not Jesus who comes down, it's the Word. The Word's not Jesus. The Word becomes Jesus at the incarnation in 1:18, and the Word became flesh. Okay, that's Jesus. So, just in reading John, look what you've read into the text. You've automatically assumed the Word is Jesus. Well, it's not. It's just read the text. So,
and what about Philippians when Jesus came down?
That's again not Jesus. Okay. The Son did not think, the being did not think holding on to divinity was something to hold on to, but he surrendered it and then becomes this new being, a slave. So it's not coming down from heaven. It's a change in status.
Okay.
You're reading John into Philippians.
It's fun to do.
Huh?
All right, Honor, what do you have to say? When she gets herself.
Okay, there.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Okay, well, I'm just wrestling with the picture. What I hear from you and Mr. Scontt and other people who have addressed us, that virtually all we can have any surety about is that somewhere in a relatively short time, which we think of as 33 years starting from the year one, but it was somewhere around there, something happened. It was something apparently rather astounding because it seems to have affected a lot of people. Now, when we talk about Paul, Paul, it affected him in some way because we have this point where apparently he's wrestling with it too and trying to figure out, what is this that happened? What did it mean? And he has this apocalypsis or whatever the Greek word was. And he's satisfied with that. Then the astounding nature of whatever it was happened during those 30-some years. And perhaps it's the spread of the idea of that due to Paul and some other people made a lot of people for centuries trying to figure out, what does it mean? What really happened? What's going on here? And then we come to the 3rd and 4th century, and it's kind of solidified. We say, well, okay, we choose this, we choose this, we choose this as being the truth. But we still don't really know the truth. We really still have to keep wrestling like those guys at the beginning. So what really happened?
Yeah, Brendan, in 2 minutes,
Okay.
tell us what really happened.
I can tell you.
Thank you, Honor.
Honor's asking a very good question. But she's asking a series of questions. And I'm going to pop the balloon again. It's not 33 years. It happened in even less time than that. You're at base. I think when you're thinking about Jesus, you ought to think about months, a year at the most. Okay, it's a relatively short period of time. Was it astounding? This is where we get caught up. We think it has to be astounding to be influential. No, it has to be some kind of experience that's striking. You kept talking about the idea. Christianity is not an idea. It's an experience. These communities are not involved in ideas. They're involved in experience. Something is, that's what gets transmitted. Now, it eventually becomes ideas. They start to think about it. They tell stories about it. They even eventually in the 3rd century actually do theology about it. They begin to argue about it. All that really begins to happen, and it does go. But there's not a lot of people involved in here. At the end of the 2nd century, there were probably less than 100,000 of these followers of Jesus. Not a big group. Okay? Even when Constantine favors Christianity, it's the minority religion. Okay? It's not the majority of religion. So I scale back your expectations. It's
Okay, could I ask another question?
it's a small group. But I think what one needs to concentrate on is the experience. What do they experience? And they tell us what they experience. They experience healing. They experience salvation, wholeness. Those are powerful emotions in an imperial world. They experience safety, togetherness, belonging.
That's beautiful.
Those are very powerful emotions.
Yeah.
It's
Okay,
not ideas.
I love that. I would like to get some kind of a bead on how did they arrive at the point of having the experience? Say they didn't know anything about Jesus or what he did or said or had done to him, and suddenly this comes to them and they start experiencing it. How did the experience get to them?
The experience got to them by experiencing it with other people. It's a communal thing. It's not an individual thing.
But how did it get to the community then?
That's that part, I think, is the part you can trace right back to Jesus. The fundamental thing that we seem, when you sort through the historical Jesus stuff, what lies at the bottom of the historical Jesus is common meals, common eating, common healing, common property. That's what seems to lie at the base of it.
And somehow that spread. Somehow that spread around, right?
Well,
what I'm going to have to ask us to kind of come to an end.
Here, she's asking a really good question.
I know she is. So go ahead.
If you start off with 12 people follow Jesus, and you multiply that by 7%, in 150 years, you'll have close to 160,000 people.
Why do you use 7%? Where does that come from?
Because that's the growth rate of almost all new religions.
Oh, okay.
Sociologically, we know that's a sustainable growth rate. The Mormons actually have been well studied. They're the major big religion that is, the Mormons start off rather small, and 7%. It accumulates if you keep growing. So you don't have to don't imagine a big number.
Okay.
It starts off with a small group, but if those groups are coherent and they're organized, and you get a genius like Paul and a couple other geniuses who can begin to organize this and move it in, it can grow. It works.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for really wonderful questions. Wonderful discussion here with everybody. Sarah, we are kind of running out of time. Do you have a quick thing to say to wrap it up?
I think it is a quick question. Several of us have mentioned Saul, Paul, and you always mention Paul. Could you speak to that?
Well, the Saul Paul thing comes from Acts.
Okay.
Okay. And he uses that change in name as a way to signify, a change in Paul, because changing your name in the ancient world is a common kind of phenomenon. When you change your status, you get a different name. We still do it today in marriage ceremonies. The woman has changed her status. The man has not. That's why she changes her name to his. Might want to rethink all of that. But at any rate, that's why he's doing that. And early Jesus followers frequently did take new names when they joined the group. We have evidence of that in some way. Some didn't, some did. It's kind of a mixed thing. Saul and Paul are just two versions of the same name. They're not really two different names. One's a more Aramaic and one's Greek. Paulus is a Greek name.
All right. Well, we could obviously, Brendan, you got us stirred up tonight. We could ask a lot more questions, but you've got us thinking about a lot of things. I love some of the summaries that you came to about what really is the essence of what Paul left for us. It's really beautiful. And I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight and challenging us, but also inspiring us to think more, to learn more, to grow. So I'm going to close this up here by just thanking everybody for your participation. This was the January 2024 textual study on the Bible and Beyond discussion titled, Did Paul Convert to Christianity? Led by Dr. Brandon Scontt. Once a month from 8 to 9 Eastern Time on Monday nights, usually the 4th of the month, we provide a discussion of one or more of the early Christian texts. Each month, one of our knowledgeable scholars leads these sessions, sharing a well-framed overview of these early Christian texts, allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. So let me tell you about next month. A good colleague of Brandon Scontt is Dr. Perry Key. He's coming back to talk more about Paul, and his focus is going to be a comparison between Paul in the book of Acts and Paul's letters. I also want you to be aware that there are 2 more Bible and Beyond courses starting up in March. On March 7th, we'll begin the course called Healing Violence in the World, the letter of Peter to Philip, which is in the Nag Hammadi collection. The other course is based on the book that Brandon co-authored, After Jesus, Before Christianity. That course begins on March 19th. So check out earlychristiantext.com website for those details. And as you know, we rely on your support to be able to produce these textual studies. We're so grateful to all of you who've been already pledged your support via Patreon. If you haven't yet become a subscriber, here's the QR code that will help you get right there, or else go to patreon.com, Bible and Beyond, to make a pledge that's just right for you. Again, PayPal or check is also an option that we certainly appreciate. Check out the website, earlychristiantexts.com, for details. And thank you so much.